My name is Evelyn. I'm in my late 30s now, and for most of my adult life, I wore roles that looked ordinary from the outside. Wife, stepmother, steady professional, the person who remembered birthdays and paid bills on time. If you passed me in a grocery store or sat across from me at a family dinner, you probably wouldn't have noticed anything remarkable. People often describe me as calm, agreeable, easy, the kind of woman who doesn't make things difficult. And for a long time, I let that be the whole story others told about me. I'm sharing this now, not because I'm proud of what happened, and not because I'm trying to expose anyone for spectacle. I'm telling it because silence has weight, and sometimes the quiet version of a story is the most honest one. This is the day I discovered my husband and mother-in-law had planned my divorce. So I'd walk away with nothing, not as a headline, but as a lived experience that unfolded slowly, almost politely, while I was still making dinners and folding laundry. People assume that betrayal announces itself loudly, that it comes with shouting, slammed doors, or obvious cruelty. Mine didn't. It arrived through omissions, through paperwork handled for me, through conversations I was never meant to hear. By the time I understood the scheme, the paperwork was ready, and I was already meant to lose everything. Not just money or property, but the life I thought I was building in good faith. This isn't a story about revenge. There are no dramatic confrontations, no villains twirling mustaches, no sudden twists of luck. What happened instead was quieter, and in some ways, more unsettling. It's about what it feels like to realize you were underestimated, not because you were weak, but because you were kind. It's about learning that being invisible can make you vulnerable, but it can also give you time to see clearly. Over the course of this story, I'll walk you through who I was in that family, how small dismissals accumulated into something dangerous, and the moment I understood that staying silent didn't have to mean staying powerless. You'll hear about decisions made without anger, actions taken without spectacle, and an ending that didn't look like victory, but felt like justice in its own quiet way. I'm not here to tell you who was right or wrong in simple terms. I'm here to tell you what it felt like to stand inside a life that was being rearranged behind my back, and what it took to step out of it without losing myself. I promise honesty, not drama, reflection, not retaliation. If you've ever had the sense that something in your life shifted long before you had words for it, if you've ever wondered whether your silence was protecting others more than it was protecting you, then maybe this story will feel familiar. Before we go any further, let me ask you gently, have you ever trusted a situation simply because no one raised their voice? To them, I was dependable in the way furniture is dependable. Always there, rarely questioned, quietly useful. I don't say that with bitterness. It's simply the clearest description. In my husband's family, I occupied a role that didn't require much explanation because it had already been decided long before I understood it myself. I was the woman who handled things. If something needed organizing, I did it. If there was tension, I smoothed it over. If a plan needed follow-through, I made sure it happened without asking for credit. At family gatherings, I was the one in the kitchen when conversations turned loud in the living room, not because I was excluded explicitly, but because no one ever thought to ask me to sit down, and I didn't think to ask either. My husband often described me as low maintenance. He said it like a compliment. To him, it meant I didn't demand reassurance, didn't argue over decisions, didn't disrupt the flow of his life. I had my own job, my own income, my own sense of responsibility. I never embarrassed him. I never contradicted him in front of others. Over time, this became my defining trait in their eyes. I was safe, predictable, manageable. His mother saw me similarly, though she used different language. She told people I was practical and not emotional. She liked that I didn't challenge her opinions or ask too many questions. When she spoke about family matters, she spoke as if I were a helpful assistant rather than a stakeholder. I noticed it early, but I told myself it didn't matter. I wasn't raised to compete for space at tables. I was raised to earn my place by being useful. Looking back, I can see how carefully the image of me was constructed, not through malice, but through assumption. Everyone assumed I would always adapt, that I would accept explanations without details, that I wouldn't look too closely at decisions made for my benefit. And because I didn't resist those assumptions, they hardened into expectations. I paid bills that weren't technically mine. I signed forms without being invited into the full conversation around them. I deferred when financial discussions became abstract or rushed. Not because I didn't understand, because I trusted the people speaking to me. I trusted that marriage meant shared interests and that family meant mutual protection. What they never asked themselves was who I was when no one was watching. They didn't notice that I read every document before signing, that I kept copies of everything, not out of suspicion, but habit. They didn't notice that I listened more than I spoke, or that silence for me was rarely empty. They assumed my calm meant compliance, not consideration. In their story, I was the background character, the one who wouldn't make waves, the one who would be fine no matter how things turned out. And for a long time, I let myself believe that too. It was easier, it kept the peace. It made me feel needed, even if it didn't make me feel seen. I didn't realize then that being underestimated isn't neutral. It creates opportunity, not just for those doing the underestimating, but for the one being overlooked. At that stage of my life, though, I wasn't thinking in those terms. I was still trying to be good, still trying to be reasonable, still trying to deserve my place by taking up as little space as possible. To them, I was reliable, invisible, replaceable if necessary. To myself, I was simply doing what I thought love required. And that difference, between who I was to them and who I believed myself to be, would eventually become the most important gap in the story. The first time it happened, I didn't have language for it. That's what made it easy to dismiss. We were sitting at the dining table on a Sunday afternoon, the kind of day that felt intentionally slow. My husband had just come back from visiting his mother, and he was recounting the conversation the way people do when they expect agreement. He mentioned almost casually that she thought it would be simpler if certain financial decisions stayed between him and her for now. He smiled when he said it, as if the word simpler carried its own justification. I remember nodding, not because I agreed, but because I didn't want to interrupt the flow of the moment. I told myself it wasn't exclusion, it was efficiency. Families have habits, I reasoned. This was probably just one of theirs. But something in my body registered the moment differently than my mind did. A small tightening, a pause that lingered longer than it should have. I felt like a door had closed softly somewhere in the house, not slammed, not locked, just shut. Later that evening, I asked a question. It wasn't confrontational. I asked what kinds of decisions he meant. He waved his hand in a way that suggested the details weren't important. Nothing that affects you, he said. And because he said it with certainty, I accepted it. Or rather, I accepted the discomfort of not pushing back. That was the first cut, small enough to be mistaken for imagination. After that, there were more moments like it. Tiny revisions to shared plans, conversations that ended just before I entered the room, references to discussions I hadn't been part of. None of it is dramatic. None of it is overtly unkind. If I had tried to describe it to someone else, I would have sounded petty, so I didn't describe it. I absorbed it. What struck me later was how quickly everyone else normalized it. His mother spoke as if I'd always been peripherally involved. My husband mirrored her tone. I started adjusting my expectations, telling myself that not everything needed my input. That trust meant letting go. Still, I remembered each instance, not in a resentful way, more like placing stones in a pocket. Each one lights on its own, but together heavy enough to notice. One evening, I overheard his mother on the phone. She didn't know I was within earshot. She was talking about contingencies and making sure things were protected. I didn't hear my name, and that absence felt louder than if I had. When she noticed me later, she didn't look startled, just mildly inconvenienced, like someone realizing they'd spoken aloud instead of thinking. I told myself again that it was nothing, that I was being sensitive. Those years of stability had earned me trust, not suspicion. But trust, I was learning, isn't just about believing people won't hurt you. It's about being included in the decisions that could. The cuts remained small, paper thin, easy to heal over if you didn't look too closely, and that was the point. No one around me reacted because nothing appeared wrong. I was still comfortable, still married, still functioning, still fine. Except I had started to feel like something was being rewritten without my consent. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't demand explanations. I simply began to pay attention in a different way. Not with fear, but with clarity. I started noting what was said and what wasn't, who spoke with authority and who was assumed to comply. Patterns began to form, faint but unmistakable. At the time, I thought I was just being careful. I didn't realize I was already stepping out of the role I'd been assigned. The first small cut didn't hurt enough to stop me, but it hurt enough to make me remember. Once something happens more than once, it stops feeling like an accident. It becomes a pattern. and patterns have a way of reshaping your sense of normal if you don't interrupt them early. At first, I kept telling myself that nothing had really changed, that I was still respected, still valued. The evidence I used to support that belief was subtle but comforting. My husband still asked about my day, still relied on me to manage our household logistics, still leaned on me when things went wrong at work. His mother still praised my reliability in front of others. On the surface, everything looked intact. But underneath, the decision-making had quietly shifted away from me. Financial conversations started happening without me present. When I asked follow-up questions later, I was given summaries instead of details. "It's all standard," they'd say. "You don't need to worry about it." The phrase "you don't need to worry" began to sound less like reassurance and more like instruction. I noticed how often I was thanked for my flexibility, how frequently my willingness to adapt was framed as a virtue. If I hesitated, even briefly, it was met with confusion, sometimes mild irritation, as if I'd violated an unspoken agreement. I had been useful because I didn't complicate things. The moment I showed curiosity, the atmosphere changed. So I stopped asking as many questions. Not because I didn't have them, but because I didn't want to be seen as difficult. I rationalized it easily. Marriage requires compromise. Families operate differently. Not everything needs to be a negotiation. That's how disrespect becomes normalized. Not through cruelty, but through repetition paired with plausible explanations. I watched how my husband deferred to his mother in ways he never did with me. When she suggested something, it was considered. When I did, it was discussed later or quietly revised. He didn't dismiss me openly. He simply placed my input lower on the hierarchy, and because I didn't challenge that hierarchy, it held. What unsettled me most was how reasonable it all seemed. There were no raised voices, no ultimatums, just an ongoing implication that my perspective was optional, convenient, but not essential. I began to sense that my role wasn't to participate, but to support outcomes already decided. At family dinners, I found myself listening more than contributing. Not because I had nothing to say, but because I'd learned the rhythm of interruption. The pauses where no one looked at me. The way topics shifted when I entered the conversation. It wasn't hostility. It was assumption. They assumed I was fine on the margins, and I told myself I was. I justified staying quiet by telling myself I was choosing peace. That my silence was maturity, not erasure. That reaction would make me look insecure. I took pride in being steady, in not needing constant validation. But there's a difference between not needing validation and being systematically excluded. The moment that clarified this for me was small, almost mundane. I discovered a document saved on our shared computer, financial projections, neatly organized, recently updated. My name appeared only once, in a line that labeled me as a dependent rather than a partner. It wasn't malicious. It was worse than that. It was administrative. When I asked about it, my husband looked genuinely surprised that I'd noticed. He explained it away quickly, telling me it was just how the software categorized things. "It doesn't mean anything," he said. And maybe to him, it didn't. To me, it meant I was being defined in rooms I wasn't invited into. I didn't argue. I didn't accuse. I closed the conversation the way I'd learned to, by letting it go outwardly while holding on to it internally. I started keeping mental records, not out of suspicion, but out of self-preservation. The disrespect wasn't loud enough to force a reaction. It was quiet enough to require awareness. And awareness, once activated, doesn't switch off easily. By then, I had started to understand something I hadn't before. Silence can be imposed, but it can also be chosen. At that stage, mine was still a mixture of both. I was quiet because it felt safer, because it kept things smooth, because I believed that if I stayed reasonable, the system would eventually recognize me. I hadn't yet seen that the system was functioning exactly as intended. I was adapting to a role that benefited everyone except me, and calling that adaptation love. It didn't arrive as a revelation. There was no single moment where everything clicked into place. Instead, the understanding settled in slowly, like dust after something heavy has moved through a room. Once it settled, I could see the outlines clearly. I had been assigned a role, not through discussion or agreement, but through repetition and expectation. I was the stabilizer, the one who absorbed the inconvenience so others wouldn't have to, the one whose flexibility made everyone else's rigidity possible. In that family system, my value wasn't measured by authority or influence. It was measured by how little friction I created. I was reliable, useful, invisible. Once I saw that, I began noticing how often my needs were framed as optional, while everyone else's were treated as urgent. If my schedule conflicted with something, it was assumed I'd adjust. If my opinion differed, it was softened until it aligned with theirs, or quietly set aside. No one said, "Your voice doesn't matter." They didn't have to. The structure communicated it clearly. My husband didn't think of himself as unkind. In his mind, he was being practical. His mother had opinions. I had patience. Those two qualities, he seemed to believe, naturally belonged where they were. I don't think he ever asked himself why his patience was never tested the way mine was. And I didn't challenge it. That's important to say. I participated in my own minimization because I thought that was what partnership required. I believed being chosen meant being accommodating. I told myself that love wasn't about power, and that wanting more visibility was a kind of selfishness. But there's a difference between humility and erasure. The clearest sign of my assigned role came during a conversation about the future. We were discussing long-term plans, retirement, investments, and contingencies. His mother spoke with confidence, referencing strategies and protections. My husband nodded along. When I added a thought, it was acknowledged politely and then absorbed into a different plan that excluded me again. No one argued with me. They simply redefined the conversation around me. I remember sitting there, listening, realizing that I was being discussed as part of the environment rather than as a decision maker, like a constant variable, present but not influential. It was a strange feeling, not anger, more like clarity edged with disappointment. That was when I understood that my role wasn't temporary. It wasn't situational. It was structural. I was expected to be the person who didn't ask for guarantees, who trusted without verification, who would accept outcomes with grace, regardless of whether I'd helped shape them. My calm demeanor had been interpreted not as strength, but as consent. Once I recognized the role, I also recognized its cost. I began to notice how tired I felt. Not physically, but ethically. How often I compromised my own sense of fairness to keep things smooth. How frequently I told myself, this isn't worth addressing, when what I really meant was, I don't want to disrupt my place here. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me quiet in a different way. I stopped trying to prove my usefulness. I stopped volunteering explanations. I stopped filling silences that weren't mine to fill. Not as a tactic yet, more as a boundary I hadn't known I was allowed to set. And something subtle shifted. They didn't notice at first. Why would they? My role had never required active engagement from them. As long as I remained functional, the system worked. My internal withdrawal didn't register as a change because my external behavior stayed polite. But inside, I had stopped seeing myself through their expectations. I began asking myself questions I'd avoided before. What would it mean to be considered, not just included? What would it mean to protect myself, not just the peace? What would happen if I took my own long-term security as seriously as they took theirs? I didn't yet know where those questions would lead. I only knew that I could no longer pretend I didn't see the role I'd been placed in. And once you see a structure clearly, you can't unknow it. The shift didn't happen during an argument or a crisis. There was no confrontation, no raised voice, no dramatic moment where I demanded answers. It happened on an ordinary weekday afternoon, in the quiet space between obligations. I had taken the day off work for something minor, an appointment that ended earlier than expected. When I got home, the house was empty in a way that felt briefly peaceful before it felt revealing. I made tea. I sat at the desk we shared. And without intending to, I opened a folder on the computer that I'd seen many times before, but never examined closely. At first, I was just curious. That's important. I wasn't searching for betrayal. I was following a thread that had been gently tugging at me for months. Inside the folder were drafts of documents, legal language, asset summaries, projected outcomes. They weren't finalized, but they were organized, deliberate. And as I read, a slow, unmistakable understanding settled in. This wasn't planning for a future together. It was planned for an exit that didn't include me. I remember how calm I felt in that moment. Not numb, clear, as if my emotions had stepped aside to let my mind take notes. I saw my name referenced in neutral, almost abstract terms. I saw timelines that assumed my compliance. I saw protections built for everyone except me. There it was in black and white, a version of my life where my absence was anticipated, and my consent was implied rather than requested. I didn't cry. I didn't panic. I didn't feel the urge to call anyone. I simply kept reading until I understood the scope of it. By the time I understood the scheme, the paperwork was ready, and I was already meant to lose everything. Not through cruelty, but through precision. The most unsettling part wasn't the content. It was how logical it all seemed. The language was clean, reasonable, framed as responsibility, as foresight. There was no acknowledgement of harm because, in their framing, none existed. I was an outcome to be managed, not a person to be consulted. When I closed the folder, I sat very still. I remember noticing the sound of the refrigerator, the hum of the house continuing as if nothing had changed. And in a way, nothing outside me had. But inside, something fundamental shifted. I realized then that my silence had been interpreted as permission, that my calm had been mistaken for ignorance, that the role I'd been assigned had a final stage, and I was approaching it without having agreed to any of it. That realization didn't make me want to confront them. It made me want to understand them fully. I spent the rest of the afternoon reviewing what I'd seen, not obsessively, but methodically. I didn't open every file, I opened enough. Enough to see the pattern, enough to confirm that this wasn't hypothetical. This was preparation. When my husband came home that evening, I acted normally. I asked about his day, I listened. I nodded in the familiar places. He didn't notice anything different. Why would he? The shift had happened somewhere he'd never thought to look. That night, lying in bed beside him, I felt something I hadn't felt before in our marriage. Distance without resentment. Not withdrawal, but recalibration. I wasn't shutting down. I was orienting myself differently. I understood for the first time that reacting emotionally would only confirm their assumptions about me. That outrage would be expected and managed. What they hadn't accounted for was stillness paired with comprehension. I wasn't angry, I wasn't afraid. I was awake. And once that happens, you don't rush, you don't announce, you observe. You let the clarity settle until it becomes usable. The next morning, nothing had changed, but everything had. After that day, my silence was no longer accidental. It was no longer the byproduct of politeness or the habit of self-erasure. It became deliberate, measured, purposeful, and grounded in awareness. I didn't withdraw from my life. I didn't act cold or distant. In fact, on the surface, I became easier to live with. I stopped questioning things that I already knew the answers to. I stopped seeking reassurance from people who had quietly removed me from the center of their plans. I listened more, spoke less, and allowed conversations to unfold without steering them toward fairness. To them, it probably looked like acceptance. What they didn't realize was that I was no longer orienting myself around being understood. I was orienting myself around being informed. Every conversation became a source of data, not in a paranoid way, in a practical one. When his mother spoke about security or contingencies, I noted the language. When my husband mentioned timelines or future plans, I listened for what was included and what was assumed. I paid attention to how often decisions were framed as already made. They mistook my calm for resignation. In truth, I had simply stopped reacting. There's a particular kind of power in not correcting people when they believe they've accurately assessed you. I let them continue believing I was unaware, unthreatening, and compliant. I let them speak freely around me. I let them underestimate my attention span, my memory, my capacity to connect details. This wasn't deception. I didn't lie. I didn't manipulate. I just stopped volunteering the parts of myself that they had never protected. I also began making small, quiet adjustments in my own life. I reviewed documents I had access to, not secretly, but thoroughly. I made copies of things that concerned me. I organized my personal records, separating what was shared from what was mine. I didn't announce any of this because I didn't need to. What surprised me was how peaceful I felt. I had expected anger to arrive at some point, or grief, or panic. Instead, there was a steady calm, like a lake after a storm has passed. I think it was because, for the first time, I wasn't trying to maintain an illusion. I wasn't negotiating my reality with anyone else's expectations. Silence, when chosen, feels different. It doesn't shrink you, it steadies you. They continued as before. My husband spoke confidently about plans that assumed my agreement. His mother spoke as if outcomes were inevitable. They didn't check in with me, not because they were hiding something, but because they didn't believe they needed to. And I let that belief stand. At night, I would lie awake and think through possibilities. Not emotionally, logistically. What would happen if I confronted them now? What leverage did they believe they had? What protections had they built for themselves? Each question clarified the terrain. I wasn't plotting revenge, I was assessing reality. There's a difference. I also noticed something else during that time. How much emotional labor I had been doing without realizing it. The constant smoothing, reassuring, absorbing. When I stopped doing that, nothing collapsed. The house didn't fall apart, the relationships didn't implode. That told me something important. My silence wasn't holding things together. It had just been making things easier for everyone else. Once I understood that, the guilt I'd always felt about withdrawing began to fade. I wasn't being cruel, I was being accurate. I was responding appropriately to information I had been given, just not in the way they expected. They expected questions, tears, objections. What they got instead was stillness. And stillness, when it's grounded in clarity, creates space. Space to prepare, space to decide, space to act without urgency. By choosing silence, I wasn't stepping back. I was stepping into alignment with myself. What they never noticed was how much I learned simply by staying quiet. When people believe they're unobserved, they repeat themselves. They reuse language. They reveal priorities without realizing it. Over time, those repetitions form a map. And I had begun to read it fluently. They didn't notice that I remembered dates, not just obvious ones, subtle ones. When a conversation shifted tone, when a document was first mentioned, when concern appeared where there had been none before. I tracked those shifts the way some people track weather, not obsessively, just attentively. They also didn't notice that I had access, not special access, ordinary access. The kind you have when you've been trusted for years to manage logistics, files, passwords, calendars. The kind of access that doesn't raise alarms because it's always been there. I never exceeded it. I simply used it fully for the first time. I reviewed our shared financial history carefully. I compared earlier statements with recent ones. I noticed how assets had been categorized differently over time, how language had shifted from ours to managed, from shared to protected. None of it is illegal. None of it is sloppy, just intentional. I began documenting, not emotionally, but factually, dates, versions, changes. I didn't annotate with feelings. I annotated with clarity. I wasn't building a case yet. I was building understanding. What struck me was how much of the plan relied on my passivity. There were assumptions threaded through everything, that I wouldn't contest timelines, that I wouldn't question classifications, that I wouldn't seek independent advice, that I would prioritize harmony over accuracy. The entire structure leaned gently but firmly on the idea that I would remain who they believed me to be. They never considered that my silence might mean I was preparing rather than yielding. I also started educating myself quietly, not dramatically. I didn't announce that I was doing research. I read in small increments. I listened to conversations differently. I paid attention to how legal and financial systems reward those who prepare early and penalize those who react late. The more I learned, the more composed I became. Knowledge has a way of neutralizing fear. Once you understand the mechanics of something, it loses its power to overwhelm you. I wasn't spiraling, I was orienting. They continued to speak around me, not to me. Plans were referenced obliquely, futures implied. I let them. I didn't correct inaccuracies or challenge assumptions. I let their confidence remain intact because it made them careless. Carelessness isn't loud, it's comfortable. At the same time, I began strengthening parts of my life that had always existed quietly in the background. My professional standing, my personal accounts, my documentation. I didn't make sudden moves, I made consistent ones. There's a misconception that preparation requires secrecy or deception. It doesn't. It requires attention and patience. I didn't hide what I was doing, I just didn't explain it. There's a difference. What they never noticed was how my emotional energy shifted. I stopped seeking validation from them. I stopped interpreting their behavior as something I needed to fix. That freed up an enormous amount of mental space. In that space, clarity grew. I began to see how often my presence had been used as proof of stability, how my calm had reassured them that nothing needed to change. They mistook that reassurance for permanence. But permanence is an agreement, and agreements can be revoked. Still, I didn't rush. I waited until my understanding felt complete, until the pieces fit together without force, until I could see not just what they were doing, but why they believed it would work. That's the part people misunderstand about quiet preparation. It isn't passive, it's disciplined. It requires resisting the urge to act before the picture is whole. By the time I felt ready to move from observation to decision, I wasn't emotional. I was resolved. They never noticed any of this, and that was the point. The reveal didn't come with shock. By the time it happened, I had already sensed its outline. What changed wasn't my understanding of the situation, it was my understanding of myself within it. It happened late one evening, after everyone else had gone to bed. I was sitting alone at the table, papers spread out in a way that would have looked dramatic if anyone had seen it. But there was no drama in me, just quiet attention. I placed documents side by side, earlier versions and later ones, casual emails next to formal drafts. Language repeated, then refined. And in that comparison, something crystallized. The leverage wasn't emotional, it wasn't moral, it was structural. The plan they had built assumed speed. It assumed I would be confused, overwhelmed, and eager to resolve things quickly once the process was initiated. It assumed I would accept the framework they presented, because it would arrive packaged as already decided. What they hadn't accounted for was delay. They hadn't accounted for someone who would read carefully, who would understand how timelines affect outcomes, who would recognize that the difference between losing everything and protecting yourself often comes down to when, not whether, you act. I realized that much of what they had prepared relied on my ignorance of process, rather than the law itself. The documents were clean, but not immutable. The structure was sound, but only if uncontested early. The certainty they projected wasn't backed by inevitability. It was backed by assumption. That was the private reveal. Not that they were planning to leave me with nothing, I already knew that. But their confidence depended entirely on my behaving exactly as they expected. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt grounded. There's a particular steadiness that comes from knowing you don't need to confront something immediately, that you can let clarity mature before you move, that your power isn't in exposure, but in timing. I sat there for a long time, not thinking about them at all. I thought about my values, about what kind of ending I could live with. I wasn't interested in punishment. I wasn't interested in humiliation. I wanted fairness, and I wanted my dignity intact. That narrowed my options. I understood then that whatever I did next had to be irreversible, not because I wanted finality, but because I didn't want to be pulled back into negotiation on unequal terms. I didn't want to argue my way into being seen. I wanted to act from a position of clarity that didn't require explanation. The reveal wasn't about discovering a weapon. It was about discovering restraint. I closed the documents and put them away. Not hidden, just filed. I didn't stay up late plotting. I went to bed and slept deeply for the first time in weeks. The next morning, my husband kissed me goodbye the way he always did. His mother called later to discuss something trivial. Their confidence was unchanged. They still believed the narrative was progressing smoothly. And it was, just not in the direction they thought. From that point on, I stopped thinking in terms of reaction entirely. I moved into decision. Decisions don't require emotional reinforcement. They require alignment. I knew what mattered to me. I knew what I wouldn't do. I knew what I was willing to risk and what I wasn't. The rest was logistics. What surprised me most was how unburdened I felt. Knowing where you stand, even in a difficult situation, is lighter than pretending not to see what's in front of you. The reveal didn't change my behavior outwardly. It changed my posture internally. And once that shifts, everything that follows becomes intentional. The decision didn't announce itself as a moment of courage. It arrived quietly, the way clear weather arrives after days of fog. Nothing dramatic happened that day. No new information surfaced. No one said the wrong thing. I simply reached the end of deliberation. I had mapped out every reasonable option. I could confront them immediately, force the truth into the open, and demand renegotiation. I knew how that would go. There would be confusion, defensiveness, a sudden flood of explanations framed as misunderstandings. I would be urged to stay calm, to trust the process, to let professionals handle it. My urgency would be positioned as emotional instability. I could wait until the plan was executed and then react. That option was tempting in its clarity, but it relied on damage already being done. It assumed I would accept loss first and seek justice second. I knew myself well enough to know I wouldn't recover from that without bitterness. I could leave quietly without preparation, walk away before the structure fully closed around me. That would preserve some dignity, but it would confirm their assumptions, that I would exit without resistance, without understanding, without protecting myself. Or I could act deliberately within the system on my own timeline. That was the option I chose, not because it was the safest, but because it was the most aligned. I didn't need them to admit what they had done. I didn't need an apology. I needed to ensure that whatever came next did not erase me. The decision point wasn't about winning. It was about refusing to disappear. Once I chose that path, Everything simplified. The noise fell away. I stopped replaying conversations in my head. I stopped weighing hypothetical outcomes. The question was no longer, what should I do? It was what needed to be done, quietly and correctly. I committed to moving forward without alerting anyone prematurely. Not out of fear, but out of respect for the process. When you understand how fragile certain assumptions are, you don't rush to challenge them. You let them hold until they can't. I also committed to staying calm, not performatively, but genuinely. I knew that the moment I revealed my awareness would change the dynamic completely. Until then, I would remain exactly who they believed me to be. There was no thrill in that, no sense of superiority, just focus. I remember the moment the decision settled fully. I was standing at the sink, rinsing a glass, watching water run clear. I felt a sense of finality that surprised me with its gentleness. I wasn't grieving the marriage yet. I wasn't angry at his mother. I was simply done negotiating my worth internally. That internal negotiation had been the most exhausting part of all this. Once it ended, the rest felt manageable. I didn't mark the decision with words. I didn't write it down or tell a friend. I didn't need witnesses. The commitment was internal, and it was firm. From that point forward, every action I took was informed by that choice. I didn't hesitate. I didn't second-guess myself. I allowed time to work for me instead of against me. They still believed they were in control of the outcome. What they didn't realize was that control isn't about who moves first. It's about who understands the consequences of moving too soon. Once the decision was made, I moved the way I always had, carefully, consistently, without drawing attention to myself. The difference was that now, every movement had direction. I didn't announce changes. I didn't create distance. I stayed present in the rhythms of daily life. We ate dinner together. We talked about ordinary things. I continued to show up as the version of me they expected. Competent, calm, untroubled. Underneath that surface, however, I was aligning my life with reality rather than appearance. I began with structure, not dramatic overhauls, small correct adjustments. I separated what had always been mine from what had gradually been blurred into shared. Accounts, records, professional documentation. I did nothing hastily. I did nothing that would raise suspicion. I simply clarified boundaries that should never have been vague to begin with. I sought advice, but quietly. Not from people emotionally invested in my story, but from professionals whose job was to explain systems, not sides. I asked questions without framing them around betrayal or blame. I framed them around the process, around timing, around options. That approach mattered. When you remove emotion from inquiry, people answer more precisely. I learned what mattered legally and what only mattered socially. I learned which assumptions held weight and which ones collapsed under scrutiny. Most importantly, I learned how much of what they were relying on was momentum rather than certainty. I didn't interrupt that momentum. I worked within it. At home, nothing appeared to change. My husband remained confident. His mother remained assured. Plans continued to be referenced as if they were already resolved. I let them speak in that register because it cost me nothing and gave me clarity. There is a peculiar kind of invisibility that comes with being underestimated. People stop guarding their words. They repeat themselves. They assume comprehension without verifying it. That invisibility became my shield. I also paid attention to myself. I noticed how my body responded as I took these steps, not with anxiety, but with relief. Each small action returned a sense of coherence to my life. I wasn't hiding anymore. I was simply not announcing. Moving in silence isn't about secrecy. It's about proportion, about understanding which actions require explanation and which don't. I didn't owe anyone a preview of my self-respect. What surprised me was how little resistance there was. Not because the situation was simple, but because no one was watching for movement from me. They were watching for emotion, for panic, for reaction. I offered none. Instead, I offered continuity, stability, the same presence I'd always had. That consistency kept the environment predictable, which allowed me to complete what needed to be done without interference. There were moments when I wondered if this made me deceptive. I examined that honestly, and each time, the answer was the same. I wasn't concealing wrongdoing. I was declining to expose my preparation to people who had already demonstrated they wouldn't protect me. There's a difference. As weeks passed, the pieces fell into place, not with satisfaction, but with inevitability. I reached a point where I knew that whatever came next, I would not be starting from a position of loss. I had restored balance, not by confrontation, but by alignment. They still believed the outcome was predetermined. What they didn't know was that the conditions had changed, and conditions matter more than intention. By the time I finished moving in silence, I didn't feel clever. I felt ready for whatever recognition would come next, whether it arrived as understanding, conflict, or quiet collapse of assumptions. I had done what I needed to do. The rest was no longer in my hands. The consequences didn't arrive with an announcement. They seeped in, subtle at first, almost imperceptible. That's how consequences often work when they're rooted in structure rather than spectacle. At first there was confusion, a delay here, a form that required clarification, a question from a professional that couldn't be brushed aside with confidence alone. My husband mentioned one evening that something had taken longer than expected. He said it lightly, but I noticed the shift in his tone, a small crease of uncertainty where there had always been assurance. His mother became more talkative. She asked questions framed as casual curiosity, but delivered with new urgency. She wanted to check in, to make sure everyone was aligned. I listened, answered simply, and offered no new information. I didn't need to. They were beginning to feel the absence of something they'd taken for granted. My automatic compliance. Nothing had been openly challenged yet. No one had accused me of anything. But the process they believed was unfolding smoothly had encountered resistance, not from confrontation, but from reality. What unsettled them wasn't opposition, it was unpredictability. They had built their expectations around a version of me that no longer existed. And because I hadn't announced that change, they were left trying to reconcile outcomes with assumptions that no longer applied. My husband began double-checking things he'd never questioned before. He reread emails, he asked follow-up questions. He brought up topics he'd previously treated as resolved. I watched this with a calm I didn't know I possessed. It wasn't satisfaction I felt. It was confirmation. The system was responding to new variables. His mother, on the other hand, reacted differently. Where he grew cautious, she grew insistent. She emphasized urgency. She framed delays as inconveniences rather than warnings. She pushed for a resolution. And in doing so, it revealed how much of the plan relied on momentum rather than mutual agreement. I still didn't confront either of them. I stayed exactly where I had always been, present, reasonable, unreactive. I didn't correct their interpretations or fill in gaps. I let their concern grow organically. There's something disorienting about consequences that don't come with blame. They couldn't point to me and say I'd done something wrong. I hadn't raised objections. I hadn't refused cooperation. I had simply exercised agency within my rights. That ambiguity unsettled them more than anger ever could. I noticed how often my husband began seeking reassurance from me. Not about the marriage, but about logistics, timelines, expectations, my willingness to proceed. He was trying to recalibrate the picture without naming the distortion. I didn't reassure him. I answered honestly, carefully, without revealing more than necessary. The emotional shift was subtle but unmistakable. For the first time, I wasn't managing his comfort. I wasn't smoothing uncertainty. I was allowing it to exist. And uncertainty, when it appears unexpectedly, has weight. The house felt different then, not hostile, just less certain. Conversations paused longer. Plans were revisited. Confidence thinned. I didn't interpret this as a victory. I interpreted it as a consequence. What they were experiencing wasn't punishment. It was the natural result of building plans around someone else's assumed silence. I watched them adjust in real time, realizing slowly that something essential had changed, without knowing exactly what. And I remained still, because consequences don't need narration. They reveal themselves. By the time they realized something was truly wrong, the window for easy correction had already closed. It didn't happen all at once. There was no dramatic moment where someone said, "We've made a mistake." Instead, there was a growing sense of urgency layered over confusion. Questions were asked more directly. Explanations grew longer. Certainty fractured. My husband started coming home later, distracted in a way that wasn't about work. He replayed conversations aloud, as if speaking them again might change their meaning. He asked me carefully what I thought about certain outcomes he had once presented as settled. I answered truthfully, but not reassuringly. I didn't mirror his anxiety. I didn't absorb it. I let it sit where it belonged. His mother became more explicit. She called more often. Her tone shifted from managerial to concerned. She spoke about making sure things were fair, about revisiting assumptions, about how no one intended for anyone to feel disadvantaged. The language was telling. Intent had entered the conversation too late. I listened without interrupting. I didn't accuse. I didn't remind her of what I knew. I let her speak into the space created by her own unease. What they were beginning to understand, slowly, reluctantly, was that outcomes aren't controlled by intent once the process has begun. The structures they'd relied on had moved past the point where reassurance could substitute for preparation. They asked if we could reset, if we could take a step back, if we could clarify expectations. Those words would have mattered months earlier. Now they were just evidence that the leverage had shifted. I felt no pleasure in this, no sense of triumph. What I felt was a sober awareness that timing, once lost, doesn't return. The most difficult moment for me came when my husband finally asked me, directly, if I felt secure. It was the first time he'd asked that question without assuming the answer. I told him the truth, not the whole truth, but the necessary one. I said that security isn't something you feel retroactively. It's something you build intentionally, and that I was doing what I needed to do to feel stable. He didn't know how to respond to that. He had expected emotion, fear, anger, maybe tears. He hadn't expected composure paired with independence. That's when I saw regret surface, not as an apology but as disorientation. His mother, sensing the shift, tried a different approach. She emphasized family, loyalty, history. She spoke as if those concepts could override processes already in motion. I didn't challenge her framing. I simply didn't allow it to redirect me. They were trying to fix something structurally by appealing emotionally. It doesn't work that way. By then, I knew there was no version of reconciliation that wouldn't require me to give up ground I'd already reclaimed. I also knew that reopening negotiations would place me back into the role of accommodating partner, one I had consciously stepped out of. So I didn't reopen anything. I allowed the consequences to complete their arc. That was the hardest part. Not doing more, not explaining more, not offering closure on their terms. I had to trust that clarity didn't need my reinforcement. When people realize too late that they misjudged someone, they often look for a way to undo the misjudgment without acknowledging it. I didn't give them that option, not out of spite, out of self-respect. By the time they understood that things could not be fixed, only faced, the outcome was already set. And facing it would be their work, not mine. The confrontation, when it finally came, was almost anticlimactic. There was no shouting, no accusations thrown across a room, no dramatic reveal where I laid everything out and demanded accountability. It happened in a quiet space, at a time chosen for practicality rather than emotion. We sat at the table, the same table where so many conversations had passed over me without landing. This time, the air was different, not tense, focused. My husband spoke first. He acknowledged that things hadn't unfolded as expected. He said there had been misunderstandings. He used careful language, trying to name the situation without assigning blame. I let him speak until he reached the end of what he'd rehearsed. Then I spoke. I didn't list grievances. I didn't recount every small cut. I didn't accuse his mother or frame myself as wronged. I simply described what I had observed factually, calmly, without emotional emphasis. I told him that I had become aware of plans that assumed my absence from decisions that directly affected my future. I told him that I had noticed how my silence had been interpreted as consent. I told him that once I understood the scope of that assumption, I had acted to protect myself. I didn't justify those actions. I didn't ask for permission. His mother interrupted once softly to explain intentions. I let her finish, then said something simple. Intentions don't override outcomes. The room went quiet after that. Not hostile, just still. What surprised them most was my tone. I wasn't angry, I wasn't pleading, I wasn't trying to convince them of my pain. I was stating reality as it stood. I think they had prepared for confrontation in the usual sense. Raised voices, defensiveness, emotional volatility. What they hadn't prepared for was emotional absence. Not coldness, but completion. I made it clear that I wasn't there to renegotiate the past. I wasn't there to punish or reconcile. I was there to clarify boundaries and acknowledge that the relationship, as it had been structured, was no longer viable for me. There was a moment when my husband looked at me as if he were seeing me for the first time. Not as his wife, not as the stabilizing presence he'd relied on, but as someone outside his expectations. That moment held a lot of unspoken things: regret, confusion, recognition. I didn't linger in it. I told them that my decisions were already in motion, that I would continue to move forward calmly and independently, that I wished them no harm, but that I would not make myself small again to preserve comfort for others. No one argued. There was nothing left to argue about. The absence of heat took away any footing they might have had to escalate. Without anger, there was no enemy. Without drama, there was no spectacle. Just consequences, articulated plainly. When the conversation ended, it ended cleanly. No slammed doors, no threats. Just a quiet understanding that something fundamental had shifted and would not be reversed. I stood up, cleared my place at the table, and went to another room. Later, alone, I felt the weight of what had happened. Not as sadness, but as gravity. Some things, once acknowledged clearly, cannot return to their previous shape. And that was all the confrontation needed to be. I am not the person I was when this story began. And I don't mean that in a dramatic, reborn sense. I mean it in the quiet, structural way that matters more over time. I no longer confuse calm with compliance. For years, I believed that being steady meant absorbing discomfort so others wouldn't have to. I believed that love was measured by how little space I took up, how smoothly I adapted, how rarely I made my needs visible. Letting go of that belief didn't make me harder. It made me more accurate. Who I am now is someone who understands that dignity doesn't announce itself. It's practiced. It shows up in the decisions you make when no one is watching, in the boundaries you maintain even when it would be easier to yield. I didn't emerge from this bitter. That matters to me. I didn't need to frame anyone as a villain to understand what happened. People act from habit, from inherited structures, from assumptions they've never had to examine. I don't excuse the harm, but I don't carry it either. What I carry instead is clarity. I'm clear about what partnership means to me now. It means shared visibility, mutual accountability. It means that silence is chosen, not imposed. That calm is paired with respect, not convenience. I'm also clear about my own capacity. I know now that I can sit with uncertainty without rushing to resolve it for others. I can allow discomfort to exist without interpreting it as failure. I can move deliberately without explaining myself into exhaustion. The part of me that once feared being replaceable no longer governs my decisions. I don't need to earn security by being useful. I don't need to justify my presence by being agreeable. I exist on my own terms. My life is quieter now, but it's not smaller. If anything, it's more precise. I choose where my energy goes. I choose what I maintain and what I release. I don't manage other people's comfort at the expense of my own stability. Sometimes I think about the woman I was at the beginning of the story. I don't judge her. She did the best she could with what she understood at the time. She believed that trust would be returned in kind. That belief wasn't foolish, it was human. What changed wasn't my capacity for trust. It was my understanding of how to protect it. I no longer assume inclusion. I verify it. I no longer equate longevity with safety. I pay attention to process, not just intention. And I don't confuse being needed with being valued. If there's strength in me now, it isn't loud. It doesn't require recognition. It's the kind of strength that shows up as steadiness, as proportion, as an unwillingness to abandon myself quietly. I didn't win anything in the traditional sense, but I didn't lose myself, and that's the outcome I can live with. There isn't a clean moral to the story, at least not the kind that fits neatly into a single sentence. Life rarely offers that kind of symmetry. What it does offer are patterns, quiet ones, that repeat until someone chooses to notice them. If there's anything I hope stays with you, it's this. Harm doesn't always arrive as cruelty. Sometimes it arrives as efficiency, as decisions are made for the greater good, as assumptions that go unchallenged because no one thinks the person affected will object. And silence on its own is not a virtue. Silence can be wisdom, it can be patience, it can be a strategy. But when silence is expected of you, when it's required for others to feel comfortable, it becomes a risk. Not because you're weak, but because you're being counted on to disappear quietly. I didn't reclaim my life by becoming louder or harder. I reclaimed it by becoming more precise, by paying attention, by understanding that fairness is not something you receive for being good. It's something you protect by being awake. This story isn't about outsmarting anyone. It's about stepping out of a role that was never agreed to, only assumed. It's about recognizing when you're being managed instead of partnered. And it's about trusting yourself enough to act without needing permission or applause. There was no moment of revenge, no public reckoning, no humiliation. There was only alignment, and alignment, once achieved, doesn't need to be defended. If you find yourself in a situation where things are being decided around you rather than with you, I hope this story reminds you that noticing is not betrayal. Preparation is not deception, and protecting yourself does not make you unkind. It makes you responsible. I'm sharing this not to invite judgment, but reflection. Because stories like this are more common than we admit, especially among people who are dependable, calm, and easy to underestimate. If any part of this resonated with you, if you've ever been quietly assigned a role you didn't choose, or felt a shift long before you had words for it, I'd really like to hear your thoughts. What was the moment you realized your silence was being mistaken for consent? Take your time with that question. And if you feel comfortable, share your experience in the comments.
Video hữu ích, hãy ấn like và đăng ký kênh để ủng hộ mình nhé. Chúng ta sẽ gặp nhau ở những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.